And now for 16 years I've been an evangelist doing seminars on creation, evolution, and dinosaurs. People say, where does the Ice Age fit into the Bible? There certainly was an Ice Age. There's not much question. Ice came all the way down to Kansas City, Missouri. How many of you are from Ohio or Indiana or Michigan or Minnesota or one of these states that are covered by ice? They used to be covered by ice, okay? Actually, this time of year, they're still covered by ice. But there's all kinds of evidence around those states that you can prove there really was an Ice Age. When ice pushes out, it piles up a pile of rocks in front of it. When the rocks are left there, when the ice melts back, it's called a terminal moraine. If it pushes the rocks to the side, it's called a lateral moraine. When the ice melts back, it leaves behind lakes called kettle lakes. Minnesota, the land of 10,000 lakes, is full of kettle lakes. As the ice melts back, the ground actually lifts up because the weight is gone. The ground may lift up quite a ways. That's called isostatic rebound. There is no question those things actually happen. The question for the Christian is, where does this fit into the Bible? And what froze the mammoths? Some of the big, hairy, hippie elephants that are found frozen standing up, food still in their teeth. What happened to the mammoths? One year, it was reported that 20,000 mammoth tusks were extracted from the ground. Just 1 year. 20,000 tusks. Estimates are that 5 million mammoths perished in one catastrophe. These red dots indicate where frozen mammoths have been found. The yellow dots indicate where frozen rhinoceros have been found. What happened to the mammoths? Well, some of the mammoths are frozen in the upright position. Their undigested food in their stomach and mouth is an interesting situation. They died of suffocation. There's no water found in the lungs. The small ice crystals in the blood indicate they probably froze in less than 5 hours. That requires something less than 300 below zero. Now, it never gets 300 below zero on Earth. The coldest temperature ever recorded is minus 127 degrees. That's pretty chilly. But that's not cold enough to freeze the mammoths. What happened to freeze the mammoths? In 1999, I was preaching in Alaska, and I took the little tour to go out on a boat to see the Portage Glacier. And I'm standing next to this guy on the boat. I got talking to him, trying to witness to him. I said, what do you do for a living? He said, well, I drill for oil in Barrow, Alaska, near Barrow, Alaska. I said, well, when you drill down, do you find anything interesting down there? He said, you wouldn't believe the stuff we drill into down there. He said, just a few months ago, we were drilling down. We drilled through 1,000 feet of permanently frozen ground called permafrost, and we started bringing up pieces of wood. And we always take whatever comes out of the well and lay it out on the ground so we can get a sample, a core sample of what we're drilling through to know the formation. He said, we drilled straight through a tree that was standing up. The tree was 300 feet tall, standing up under 1,000 feet of permanently frozen ground. Well, I preached in Barrow, Alaska a couple years ago. There is only one tree in Barrow, Alaska, and it is about this tall in a Chinese restaurant, and they struggle to keep it alive because they don't get much sun up there for months at a time. There are no trees outside in Barrow, Alaska. There are certainly no trees 300 feet tall. There are very few trees in the world that are 300 feet tall. How do you get a tree 300 feet tall, standing up under 1,000 feet of permanently frozen ground? What happened? I'm going to give you what I call the Hovind theory of what caused all these phenomena, but I need to review a little science for you. Many people have been influential in developing this in my brain anyway. I appreciate Walt Brown and Henry Morris and Baumgartner and some of these guys that have done work, and the biblical flood and the ice epic had a great influence on me. But ultimately, I have to take the blame for this if it's wrong. I'm going to teach you a few things about science and then give you the Hovind theory. The inverse square law tells us if two objects are attracted to each other, like the Earth and the Moon, the force of attraction is inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. In English, that means if you half the distance, or if you brought the moon into 1/3 the distance, you take the 1/3, flip it over, and square it. It's now 9 times the gravitational pull. The inverse square law is one thing to learn. The second thing you need to learn is a spinning top, any spinning object, behaves in a peculiar way if it is struck by something. If you throw a rock at a spinning top, it'll wobble around for a while, or you can do it with a gyroscope, and it'll wobble around, and then it'll recover spinning smoothly, usually at some new crazy angle. You can actually determine when it was struck if you could see a graph of a wavy line of how it behaved as it was wobbling. Interesting. The Earth has no doubt wobbled through the years. The North Pole has moved around. Today the earth is tilted over 23.5 degrees, which is why they always mount the globe on that 23.5 degree angle. Stonehenge is an interesting stone building. Apparently it was built to worship the sun at summer solstice. But today, Stonehenge does not line up. The temple Amun-Ra was also apparently built to worship the sun at summer solstice, the longest day of the year. But it doesn't line up. Edexus, same thing. The earth is tilted over today, and that's what causes the seasons. Usually on June 21st, occasionally on June 20th, but usually June 21st, it's the longest day of the year. Because the earth is tilted, in our case with the northern hemisphere, we're tilted toward the sun. So we get more sunlight. And the North Pole gets pure sunlight all the time, 24 hours. George Dodwell, the famous Australian astronomer, did a lot of study of the shadows, of the solstice shadows recorded by ancient astronomers. He said, you know, it looks to me like something struck the earth. When he followed the wavy line made of the solstice shadows, he said something struck the earth about 4,350 years ago and caused the earth to wobble for several thousand years. Today the earth is pretty stable. The earth's North Pole doesn't move around very much. But could it be that something actually struck planet Earth about the time of Noah's flood? Now that's what the scientific evidence points toward. Interesting. Today the earth is tilted over, and that's what causes the seasons. The first mention of cold weather in the Bible is in Genesis chapter 8, after the flood. I doubt they had huge polar ice caps before the flood came. I flew up as far as we could fly in Canada and then drove 2 hours north of that, way up into central Saskatchewan. We were only right about here. There's a whole lot of earth above us, but they said this is about the limit of habitable land where you can actually do farming, because north of here the seasons are too harsh. You can't do any farming. There is a huge chunk of planet Earth, north and south, near the poles, that is simply unusable for farmland. Now the Bible says God formed the world to be inhabited. I don't think what we have today is anything similar to what Adam and Eve saw. Next thing you need to keep in mind, the moon has craters on it, but we never see the moon get struck by anything. Where did these craters come from on the moon? Even Mercury has craters on it. Where did these craters come from? Mars has a canyon much larger than Grand Canyon. When the scientists studied this canyon on Mars, they said, wow, this canyon formed in a matter of weeks. Because they say there was melting water in one of the craters, it overflowed the rim and washed out this canyon very, very quickly. Well, duh. Why can they see a canyon on Mars where we can't find any water for sure and say this thing formed quickly, and you can look at Grand Canyon on planet Earth and can't conclude that water formed that canyon very quickly? I don't understand the stupidity involved here. It looks to me like you ought to be able to see that. As a ridge at the edge of the crater gave way and this canyon formed in a matter of months, certainly less than a year, said one of the scientists. Next thing to keep in mind, it's called the Meissner effect. How many have ever seen two magnets? You put them together and the one will float on top of the other one. You know what I'm talking about here? It's called the Meissner effect. That's how the Japanese trains go. We rode on one of those trains when I was in Japan. Man, they go flying down the tracks with magnetic levitation. No resistance that way, no friction. Next thing to keep in mind, there are comets flying around through space, and these comets are extremely cold, 300 to 400 below 0 Fahrenheit. If you throw a snowball too fast, it'll break apart. You couldn't possibly shoot a snowball out of a cannon. If you did, it would simply break apart in pieces before it even got out the end of the barrel. So a super cold ice meteor, if it were coming toward the Earth, would build up speed because of the inverse square law. As it got going faster and faster, it would break up out in space into a bazillion little ice crystals. Those would then shower down on the Earth as super cold snow. Next thing you need to keep in mind, the Earth has a very strong magnetic field, but it's getting weaker. At the time of the flood, it was probably about 15 to 20 times stronger than it is today. The magnetic field is weakening. The magnetic field would deflect super cold ice crystals to the poles, most of them. Also, super cold ice is easily statically charged. The northern lights are caused because of the Earth's magnetic field. How many have ever seen the northern lights? Unbelievably gorgeous. If you've never seen them, it's worth just get up there. So I've seen them in South Dakota and up in Canada. Unbelievably beautiful. The northern lights are something worth seeing. Anyway, the pre-flood world was very different. The world probably had a canopy of ice or water above the atmosphere. We cover that on video 2. Now there are some creationists, including Walt Brown, who disagree. They say there was no canopy. And I think the arguments they use can be easily answered. And I'll be glad to discuss that if you'd like more. Next thing to keep in mind. Who on earth was Peleg? Genesis chapter 10, and I hate to say this about the Bible, so God, don't listen for just a minute, okay? But Genesis 10 is boring, okay? As you read through that chapter, it's got all these big names that nobody on earth can pronounce except Alexander Scorby. You know, so-and-so begot so-and-so, and he begot so-and-so, and he begot so-and-so. And you're reading through this long, boring chapter of everybody begotten everybody, and all of a sudden you come across verse 25. And it says, unto Eber were born 2 sons. The name of the one was Peleg. For in his days was the earth divided. And his brother's name was Joktan. Well, now hold on a minute. Peleg is the only guy, it doesn't say anything about anybody else. Why does it say something about Peleg? It says in his days was the earth divided. And then it says his brother's name was Joktan. Nobody else gets their brother mentioned. Why would his brother be mentioned? Well, the word Joktan means shorten. Peleg means divided. Peleg was born about 100 years after the flood. Notice he only lived to be 239. His daddy and grandpa and great-grandpa lived into their 400s. What was different? What happened in the days of Peleg? I'm going to give you the Hovind theory. Now, this is supposed to be good teaching technique. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you, and then I'm going to tell you, and then I'm going to tell you what I told you. You get all that? We're going to go through it very quickly, 8 simple steps of what I think caused the flood and explain all these strange phenomena on the planet. Then we'll go into them in a little bit more detail, and then we'll close this down. Noah and the animals got safely into the ark. A 300-degree below zero ice meteor came flying toward the earth and broke up in space. As it was breaking up, some of the fragments got caught and became the rings around the planets. They made the craters on the moon, the craters on some of the planets, and what was left over came down and splattered on top of the North and South Pole. The super cold snow fell on the poles mostly, burying the mammoths standing up. The dump of ice on the North and South Pole cracked the crust of the earth, releasing the fountains of the deep. The spreading ice caused the ice age effects, the glacier effects that we see. It buried the mammoths, made the earth wobble around for a few thousand years. And it made the canopy collapse that used to protect the earth and opened up the fountains of the deep. During the first few months of the flood, the dead animals would settle out and dead plants and get buried. They would become coal if they're plants and oil if they're animals. And those are still found today in huge graveyards. Fossils found in graveyards, oil found in big pockets under the ground. During the last few months of the flood, the unstable plates of the earth would shift around. Some places lift up, other places sink down. That's going to form ocean basins and mountain ranges. And the runoff would cause incredible erosion, like Grand Canyon, in a couple of weeks. Over the next few hundred years, the ice caps would slowly melt back, retreating to their current size. The added water from the ice melt would raise the ocean level, creating what's called a continental shelf. It would also absorb carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which allows more radiation to get in, which is going to shorten people's lifespans. And in the days of Peleg, it finally took effect. The earth still today shows the effects of this devastating flood. Now, a little more detail on each one. God told Noah, the Lord said to Noah, come thou. Did you catch that? Listen very carefully. What did God tell Noah to do? He told him to come into the ark. He didn't say go into the ark. He said come into the ark. Where does God have to be in order to say that? In the ark. That'll preach, brother. There's a sermon right there, just right there. Come into the ark, Noah. Come with me. We're going on a little cruise. Come on in. I'm here with you. And when the flood was over, God said to Noah, go out of the ark. God was with him the whole time. That would be quite the cruise. And the Lord shut the door. By the way, good eternal security verse. If the Lord's got you saved, you're saved, okay? You can't get out of God's hand. Then this 300-degree below zero ice meteor came flying through the solar system. Some of it broke apart. It made craters on Mercury and craters on the moon. 4 of the planets today still have rings around them. And the rings around these planets are made of rock and ice. Very interesting. Now, Walt Brown thinks some of the craters on the moon were formed when the fountains of the deep broke open and rocks went flying up out of Earth's gravitational pull, drifted around for a while and clobbered into the moon. He may be right on that, I don't know. But it's interesting. He thinks the comets came from Earth. And water on Mars came from Earth when the fountains of the deep broke open. You could read about it for yourself if you'd like. The super cold snow would land mostly around the poles, because super cold ice is not only affected by the magnetic field, it's affected by, it's easily statically charged. How many have seen the Van de Graaff generator where they make your hair stand up? You know, we've got one of those at our science center at Dinosaur Adventureland. As this ice meteor came flying toward the Earth, it broke apart. Pieces would settle in around the poles mostly, causing the Earth to wobble for a few hundred years, or maybe even a few thousand years. The canopy of water overhead collapsed and it rained 40 days. The water underneath the bottom, under the crust, came shooting to the surface, and the water kept going up for 150 days. And everybody drowned. It probably took 6 or 8 months to kill everybody during that flood. We all get the idea, well, it rained and everybody died first day. No, it took a long time for people to die. People would be running and fighting for higher ground. As that got more and more rare, as the water keeps coming up and up and up, for 150 days, the water increased. By the way, they're still discovering chunks of ice flying around in space. Here's an article about a scientist who discovered chunks of ice as big as this auditorium are hitting the Earth all the time. They dissolve in space, but it rains down as water. There's water everywhere in space. Science and Technology article here. If you go to the North Pole, you'll be kind of chilly, and one of only 400 people that have ever been there. But up around the North Pole, there's an ocean called the Arctic Ocean. I went up to see the Arctic Ocean a couple years ago, and the guy said, hey, Brother Hovind, you know something interesting about this ocean? It has no tide. I said, man, I never thought of that. Taught her science for 15 years. Arctic Ocean has no tide. And who cares, right? Anyway, but there's an island up there called the New Siberian Islands off the coast of Russia. There on those New Siberian Islands, they find frozen bobcats, frozen lynx, frozen camels. What happened? When they drill down through the ice, when they get to the South Pole and drill through the ice, they find coal under the ice at the South Pole. I would like to point out, Your Honor, there are no trees in Antarctica. 0. Admiral Byrd went down there and said they saw frozen palm trees or palm leaves near the South Pole. Scientists have discovered all sorts of frozen leaves, even dinosaur fossils, plant-eating dinosaurs, near the South Pole. Thousands of well-preserved leaves found in Antarctica. Leaves on the side of a cliff 250 miles from the South Pole. And the leaves still retain their original cellular structure and organic content. They're not petrified. They're preserved. They find dinosaurs, plant-eating dinosaurs, in northern Alaska. There are no trees up there. I was there. Nothing. Not a blade of grass in most places. See, the Earth actually has 2 North Poles. We have a geographic North Pole where we spin around. We also have a magnetic North Pole in Canada where the compass actually points. Now here in Tennessee, it probably doesn't make a lick of difference. Your compass points north because both of them pretty much line up. But if you live in Alaska, your magnetic north is way different than the real north, and pilots have to learn to adjust for that. And who cares, right? Okay. I think what happened, the mammoths were up there chomping on their tropical flowers. It was a beautiful day. And it began to snow, super cold snow. They had never seen snow before. One of the mammoths looked at his buddy and he said, Herman, this is peculiar weather we're having here. What is this white stuff falling out of the sky? I said, I don't know, but let's get out of here. They started running around trying to find a place to hide, and the snow got deeper and deeper and deeper, and they got stuck in the snow standing up, and they couldn't even fall down. How many of you have ever been in a snowdrift so deep you couldn't even fall over? You ever been in one of those? I think that's what happened to the mammoths. People say, well, the mammoths have long hair. They're designed for cold weather. No, mammoths are not designed for cold weather. A lot of animals in the jungle have long hair where it's hot, okay? If the temperature is 70 degrees, long hair is just simply a decoration. It's neither, and there's a lot of things about the mammoth that shows they are not designed for cold weather. There's a whole section just in this book about mammoths are not designed for cold weather. You can read all about that. So the mammoths, some of them ended up frozen standing up in super cold ice, 300 below 0. As the ice goes pushing out toward the equator, it's going to carve out glacial grooves. If you live in Ohio, if you go out to Kelly's Island, you can go out in the Lake Erie and see the glacial grooves, scratches across the rock for miles. I think the ice age really happened, but it happened at the beginning of the flood. There are basically 2 theories among creationists about the ice age. One theory says the ice age caused the flood, which is what I believe. The other theory says the flood caused the ice age. A minor difference, I don't think it's worth fighting over, but Either case, though, I think the flood would, or the ice age would last several hundred years after the flood. During the time after the flood, as populations are growing, if somebody misbehaves, instead of building a jail and putting them in there where you got to feed them for the rest of their life, just banish them. Say, get out of here. You can't stay with our civilization. And boy, if times were hard and just new struggling civilization like Gilligan's Island, being banished is punishment enough. Now, you're going to follow the Ice Age animals around and kill them and, you know, leave your toolbox behind because you don't want to carry 50 pounds of rocks with you. You wait till you find the mammoth herd and you make your tools on the spot and kill the mammoth. That's why they find, you know, scrapers for skin and all kinds of flint arrowheads and stuff are found all over the world. These guys are, you know, they really do use these stone tools to kill these animals, but they don't carry them with them because they're so plentiful. They're found all over the arrowheads and stuff like that. Anyway, then this super cold ice at the pole would send off a cold wave, like when you open the freezer and the cold air comes out and falls at your feet. This cold air hitting warm air would cause it to rain. And it rained 40 days and 40 nights. The canopy collapsed. The Bible says all the fountains of the deep were broken up in one day. If you read the book of Jasher, you can get it from our ministry. I cannot verify that it's legitimate, the actual book of Jasher referred to in the Bible. There is a book of Jasher referred to in the Bible. This may or may not be it, I don't know. But it's interesting reading nonetheless. In the book of Jasher it says, "And on that day the Lord caused the whole earth to shake, and the sun darkened, and the foundations of the world raged, and the whole earth was moved violently, and lightning flashed, and the thunder roared, and all the foundations of the earth were broken up." Jasher chapter 6. Interesting. I think what happened, the dump of ice on the poles caused the earth's crust to crack. Ice spread out toward the equator, buried the mammoths, made the earth wobble, and the earth was totally covered by water. The Bible says all the high hills were covered. Now there are some idiots out there teaching it was just a local flood in the days of Noah. The Bible says the high hills were covered. It's not a local flood. If the earth were reduced down to the size of this globe right here, all the oceans in the world would only fill about 1 tablespoon. If you smoothed out the earth, the oceans right now would be 12,000 feet deep. Oceans average 12,000 feet deep. But if you smoothed out the earth, they would average 8,000 feet deep everywhere. There's plenty of water on the earth to cover the planet. When the climbers got to the top of Mount Everest, 1953, the year I was born, they got up here on Mount Everest. They began to find something interesting. Petrified clams. In Peru a couple years ago, they found giant oysters up to 11 feet across, 2 miles above sea level. That's a big oyster. You should see the pearl. And these clams are interesting. I've got some on the table down here. They're petrified clams in the closed position. Now think about it for a minute. When a clam dies, it opens. The muscle inside relaxes, the ligaments on the outside pull the shell open almost instantly. When a clam dies, it opens up. How would you get bazillions of petrified clams in the closed position on top of mountains all over the world? Well, I would like to point out, Your Honor, that Mount Everest is a little ways from the beach, number one. Number two, clams do not climb mountains very well. And number three, when a clam dies, it opens. The best explanation for this is they were buried alive. Sometimes huge beds of these are found. A guy in Opp, Alabama said, "Brother Hovind, you want some petrified clams for a museum?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "They're 4 feet thick in my backyard." When he rototills his garden, he brings up thousands of petrified clams, closed petrified clams. We've got a bunch in our museum down in Pensacola, Florida. Even fragile items like eggs are found fossilized. I believe the sediments would settle out of this flood. Fine sediments would preserve things in incredible detail. Here's a fossilized jellyfish. We have an arm to an octopus, fossilized octopus arm in our museum. Soft tissue simply doesn't fossilize. Under very special conditions are required. The Bible says the fountains of the deep broke open. So I think the earth got struck by a meteor. The water underneath went shooting to the surface, and the earth was covered with water. See, the earth's crust is kind of interesting. Pretty thin, actually, in some spots. 3 to 5 miles thick under the crust, under the oceans, and 30 miles thick under the continents. The hot water from inside the earth would come shooting out, and it would kill animals that live within a certain radius of the crack as the hot water escaped. As the basalt bulged up in the middle, the plates are going to slide down, explaining, as I said earlier, about the wrinkled mountains. Take a look at these mountains in British Columbia. They've been pressed from the end, wrinkled up. What happened? As the water came shooting out, the hot water would kill all sorts of things within a certain radius. If you poured a gallon of boiling water into your aquarium, it would kill all the fishies within a certain distance, okay, till the temperature was dissipated. All over the world, little tiny creatures called diatoms are found dead in great big thick beds called diatomaceous earth. These diatoms are super tiny. It takes about 1,000 years to get an inch of dead diatoms at the bottom of the ocean. They very slowly accumulate. When it dries out, they pack it into a special powder called diatomaceous earth. It is used for all sorts of things. It's used as kitty litter. It's used as oil dye. Diatomaceous earth is used as swimming pool filters, used in bricks, used in aspirin. It's used in medicines. It's used in all sorts of strange things you would never think of. It's diatomaceous earth because it is so absorbent. I was in Lompoc, California preaching, and I went to visit the world's largest diatomaceous earth quarry. I believe it's the world's largest. They're in Lompoc, California, which is right smack on top of the San Andreas Fault. There in Lompoc, California, back in 1876, they found the fossil skeleton of a whale standing on end, 80 feet long, running through diatomaceous earth. Now, I know the whale is parallel with the layers. That's okay, because the layers have tilted up also. So the thickness of the whale becomes the problem, not the length. But still, if this stuff accumulates an inch every 1,000 years, how long is a dead whale going to lay there waiting for this stuff to gather around him? Dead whales are dissolved at the bottom of the ocean in a few weeks or months. Even the bones eventually disappear. They gave me a chunk of their diatomaceous earth out there. In that one little square foot, there are dozens, maybe even up to 60 fish skeletons. You know, fish skeletons are found in diatomaceous earth, and they're found with their gills extended, their fins extended. They died terrified. Whatever was happening to them was terrifying these creatures. Fossil fish are found by the trillions. The chalk cliffs of England and Dover, England are found this way. Chalk, from the Latin word crescia, which means chalk. Chalk 300 feet thick. There was a catastrophe that formed all this. The Bible says the waters prevailed upon the earth. I think what happened during the first part of the flood, dead things settled out. And that flood represents God's judgment on this planet. Point number 5 of the Hovind theory is during the first few months of the flood, the dead animals would settle out. People ask, why aren't more human fossils found? Well, humans are smarter than animals. Some humans are, and some animals. And they would tend to avoid drowning till the last possible minute. Animals that are buried on top or very, very shallow soil are not going to fossilize. Think of all the millions of buffalo that were killed out west in the last few hundred years. None of them fossilized because they weren't buried.
You've been watching part of The Creation Series by Kent Hovind. This faith-strengthening series is over 15 hours long and is available on 7 DVDs. If you would like more information on the Creation Series,